Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a seriously provocative philosophical premise. It's an idea that touches on faith, atheism, and the incredibly complex history of human morality. Now, we aren't here to tell you what to believe. Instead, we're going to examine a fascinating thought experiment derived from our source material, one that absolutely challenges our everyday assumptions about belief and non-belief.
All right, let's dive right into this massive quote from 19th century French writer Edmond de Goncourt. We're going to treat this not as an absolute theological truth, but as a really compelling hypothesis. De Goncourt is basically suggesting that if a divine being exists, the outright denial of that being might actually be less offensive than the flawed, human-made interpretations that claim to represent it. It's a wild concept, isn't it? The idea that rejecting something entirely could be seen as more respectful than getting it horribly, dangerously wrong?
So, this premise sets up a pretty stark contrast. Over on one side, you've got atheism, a clean break. In the context of this argument, it's an outright denial, sure, but there's absolutely no pretense. It's just a simple, unpretentious no. But on the other side, you have corrupted religion. This is where flawed human interpretations, dogmas, and conflicts actively distort the divine. The hypothesis asks us to weigh these two against each other, the simple rejection versus the active misrepresentation.
Section 1. Historical distortions of faith, and examining the evidence through time.
Because century after century, we see this exact pattern. Humans just have this recurring tendency to co-opt the sacred. We're talking medieval holy wars during the Crusades, the systemic persecution of the Spanish Inquisition, all the way up to the religious panic of colonial Massachusetts. This establishes that twisting the divine isn't just a one-off anomaly. It is a deeply ingrained, consistent pattern in human history.
Let's actually zoom in on that first major pillar, the Crusades. Officially, these were sanctioned by the Catholic Church as holy missions to reclaim Jerusalem. But the reality on the ground was starkly different. It involved mass violence and mass looting. During the 1099 sack of Jerusalem, soldiers slaughtered thousands. Muslims, Jews, even fellow Christians. So, looking at this through the lens of our quote, if a hypothetical God exists, would he find the straightforward denial of an atheist less insulting than mass violence committed in his name? It's basically twisting divine will to mask human greed and brutality.
Fast forward a bit, and the Spanish Inquisition gives us another grim example. Built to enforce orthodoxy, this institution systematically tortured and executed thousands of people, usually on incredibly flimsy evidence of heresy. We are talking about human beings literally burned alive, all under the banner of upholding God's truth. Our source material highlights this as a profound perversion. They turn divine justice into a mechanism of pure terror and oppression. Honestly, compared to a system orchestrating that kind of cruelty in the name of the sacred, an atheist's simple "I don't believe" starts to look remarkably benign.
20. That's how many individuals were executed during the 1692 Salem witch trials in colonial Massachusetts. Driven by pure superstition and a wildly distorted interpretation of Christian teachings, Puritan leaders turned their own community into a paranoid hunting ground. It's this intensely concentrated, localized example of how human fear, when it's dressed up as a divine mandate, leads straight to irreversible tragedy.
Now, the timeline changes, but the human flaws, they stay incredibly consistent. Look at how the exact same greed that drove Crusader looting echoes in today's prosperity gospel. The oppression of the Inquisition, it mirrors modern systemic abuse cover-ups, and medieval holy wars find an echo in modern religious extremism. We're really just seeing ancient flaws dressed up in modern contexts, neatly categorized by those exact same human failings: violence, greed, and oppression.
Which brings us to Section 2, modern religious contradictions, and how the pattern continues today.
Our sources point straight to modern religious extremism and terrorism, specifically groups like ISIS. In recent years, they've justified beheadings, enslavement, and mass killings, like the horrific 2014 Yazidi genocide, claiming a divine mandate derived from their extreme interpretation of Islam. Now, going right back to our premise, if a God exists, you could strongly argue that using sacred texts to rubber stamp and sanctify absolute horrors is a far greater affront than someone just refusing to acknowledge divinity altogether. It is the active weaponization of the sacred.
Now, I really want you to focus on this highly memorable phrase from our sources: God as a cosmic ATM. It perfectly captures the totally controversial theology of the prosperity gospel. We're shifting away from physical violence here, straight into spiritual and financial exploitation. Championed by televangelists like Kenneth Copeland and Joel Osteen, this prosperity gospel preaches that faith, and very specifically monetary donations to their ministries, will directly result in material wealth for the believer. Our source material heavily criticizes this as an explicit commodification of spirituality. Basically, these figures presume to speak for the divine entirely for financial gain, often exploiting the most financially and emotionally vulnerable people out there. Hypothetically, turning the sacred into a transactional business model could definitely be viewed as deeply disrespectful compared to an atheist skepticism. The atheist, after all, doesn't put words in the divine's mouth just to line their own pockets.
And we see this stark contradiction incredibly vividly in the Catholic clerical abuse scandals. You had institutions publicly claiming absolute moral superiority, literally dictating the rules of morality to their followers, while hypocritically engaging in systemic global cover-ups. Following revelations like the 2002 Boston Globe investigation, the world saw widespread evidence of sexual abuse by priests, shielded by the very authorities claiming that moral high ground. Betraying the flock while wearing the robes of divine representation, that is exactly the kind of insult our opening quote refers to.
All right, let's pull all this together in Section 3. This synthesis, the meaning of non-belief.
Ultimately, what we're seeing is that humans consistently project their own inherent flaws, power hunger, greed, violence, self-preservation, onto something they claim is sacred and perfect. And that immensely complicates the nature of organized religion. Atheism, by contrast, operates as a clean break. There's no pretense. It doesn't attempt to drag the concept of the divine down into the mud of human failing. Therefore, according to our sources, historically and today, corrupt religious actions could logically be seen as the ultimate blasphemy. Way worse than just non-belief.
It really distills the entire argument down to a tragic irony. The atheist looks at the universe and simply says, "I see no God." It is a statement of personal absence, a void. But the corrupt figure? They point to violence, greed, or systemic injustice and proclaim, "This is God." That is active defamation.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final question to ponder on your own. It sits right at the fascinating intersection of human nature, religious institutions, and the concept of the divine. If divine truth is constantly distorted by our own human flaws, is the simple refusal to believe a more honest stance than participating in a corrupted system? It's a pretty powerful thought, and one that absolutely reframes how we look at both faith and skepticism in our modern world. Thanks for diving into this concept with us today, and keep questioning what you see.